Welcome to the Climate Trends podcast. As part of our special series on plastics, in the last episode, we had a very interesting conversation on the science behind plastics pollution. We talked about what makes plastics such a hidden health hazard, from the chemicals they carry to the myth of recycling. We heard how the crisis goes far beyond waste management into the realms of petrochemical exposure, regulatory failure, and dangerous industry driven substitutions. This week, we go upstream. Because before plastics become bottle or bags, they are traded chemicals, monomers, and polymers shipped across borders, often from petrochemical giants to the global south. This episode will explore the role of international monomer and polymer trade in driving plastic pollution. Why single use plastics remain a global policy blind spot despite their environmental toll? What India and other emerging economies must push for to ensure a just and effective global plastic treaty. As negotiations intensify ahead of the United Nations Environment Assembly's final meeting in the August 2025 to finalize a global plastic treaty, a new IEEFA briefing note warns. A treaty that ignores global trade in plastic feedstocks will not be enough to curb plastic pollution. In this episode, we have with us Swathi Seshadri, energy specialist at IEEFA and co-author of the briefing note, to explain why petrostates dominate the trade in ethylene polymers, one of the main ingredients in single-use plastics, and how this global flow fuels local environmental degradation. Welcome to the Climate Trends podcast, Swathi.
Thank you, Shreya. Thank you so much.
Let's start with a macro question on the issue. What is the role of trade in the global polymer and plastics industry?
So the way to understand this, we need to understand how polymers or plastics are also produced and how this industry is structured. We need to understand that petrochemical production is geographically uneven. Countries who have the feedstocks, which is oil or gas mostly, and some coal, but a lot more of oil and gas, these countries would tend to do the first level of processing to bring it to the building blocks, the olefins or ethylene and propylene and styrene and other things. So it's these few countries who have access to the oil and gas, who would make the building blocks, and then it gets further processed. Petrochemicals are an extremely complex, set of chemicals. And therefore, because of this geographical unevenness of production, but consumption is everywhere. Plastics is consumed all over the world, but it's produced only in some parts, and different parts of the petrochemicals are produced in different countries. Therefore, it's a very, very complex tapestry of chemicals, of monomers and polymers, which are kinds of chemicals, which kind of, travel across the globe from one region to the other, with every trade adding, to the complexity, where you first have the monomer, and then, you have ethylene, which is traded, and then it's processed, and then polyethylene, is further traded. And then, of course, the plastic products are made, and even then that is traded. So trade is not only in one part of the plastics life cycle, it is across the life cycle. Trade is involved right from, even the oil. For example, a country like India, which imports the oil and makes ethylene, right from trading on the feedstock, trading on the building blocks, trading on the polymers, the trading on the plastic products itself, and then even waste trade. So trade itself is a very overarching element to plastic production. We, of course, focus a lot more on the monomer and polymer parts of trade. And without this trade, you will have no plastics. Because if we look at, we look at the data subsequently, but we find few states produce much of the monomers, another few states produce much of the polymers, and then these are, traded across the globe for the next set of processing to happen. So it's a cornerstone to plastic production, and it's not something that happens post facto. It's not like the plastic is produced and then it's traded. The aspect of trade starts from the word go, right from the beginning, and therefore can't be ignored across any element, of the life cycle itself. There's some data that's available. There's one study which says that in 2022, about 436.66 million tons of polymers and plastics were traded just in that 1 year. And even final plastic, products that were traded were 111 million tons. So far more far greater trade of monomers, polymers than even the final plastic product. So there is enough evidence and studies present to show how what the volume of this trade is and how important it is for the production of plastic itself.
Thanks for sharing that number. It gives a perspective on what is the volume of the problem that the world is grappling with. In the same breath, can you also identify, some of these importers and exporters who are key to this problem, and also the trade patterns that comes with these kind of plastic traders and the impact of these trade patterns?
Right. So, in our study, we looked at two parts. We looked at the monomers and the polymers and trade in each of these. And you have the same countries coming up again and again. In all of these in all of these chemicals. But if you were to just separate the two and say, okay, what's a picture like with monomers and what's the picture like with polymers, then you have countries. You have a lot of the Asian countries as well. Who are in the picture. And if you look at ethylene, for example, South Korea is the largest, exporter of ethylene, and mostly to China. But you also have the Netherlands, you have US, UK, in the ethylene trade. In ethylene, you have Netherlands being an exporter and an importer, and you will find this in polymers as well, which basically means that these are hub countries which are perhaps processing the monomer into polymer and then exporting it also. So it's importing some parts of it, it's also processing, and then it's also exporting. So countries, and you have this in all regions. You have a few countries in Europe, you have few countries in Asia who act as hubs, which does that additional processing and then sends it forth. So yes, in you have Germany as well, who is a critical exporter in the context of polypropylene. With styrene, you have Belgium, India, Mexico, Turkey, which are the critical importers, of styrene. And for PTA, which is a monomer which is important for the PET. We say PET bottles, the PET bottle, it's an important monomer for that. You find China being a very, very prominent, player in that. But if I were to, so that's the monomers. When it comes to the polymers, you have, again, very similar countries. It's not very different. And then you realize it's a few countries who concentrate, on the upstream part of the production. And you have China, Mexico, the US, and all of these. I mean, not China, but the US and others who are also the petrostates. So you find that petrostates are actually leading the polymer export. China, of course, also makes polymers from coal, and there is a lot of coal in China. So you find petrostates leading. One trend is that petrostates are leading polymer export, especially in polyethylene. You find that trend. Saudi Arabia is again a very, very big player in polyethylene, another big petrostate. So you have petrostates who are leading the polymer trade. The other is that you have intra-trade patterns. I mean, intra-regional trade patterns. So you have each region having some, hub countries. For example, US exports primarily to Mexico and Canada. So it's, within the Americas, you have the US being, a hub. Belgium and Germany are similarly a hub within Europe, where these countries are importing and exporting within the region as well. Of course, they also export outside the region, but they act as dominant hubs within the region. In the context of Asia, you actually have South Korea, Saudi Arabia, China, India being the hubs, within this region for different chemicals and different monomers. So that's another pattern we're seeing, that there are few countries in each region which are ending up being the hubs, in for their own region. And just to add a layer of interest, to this is that when we're talking in the context of the Global Plastics Treaty, it'll also be interesting to see how these countries' positions are also, because their stakes are also a lot higher, because they have a certain, leadership role, if one were to call it that way, in petrochemicals in those regions. So that's the other pattern that we see when it comes to polymers. And the other is this thing of value addition and reprocessing and re-exporting, which I also spoke about a little about, earlier in the context of Netherlands, which imports and exports. Some countries, like in Singapore, they could just be merely a transshipment hub where it's a big port, the material is coming in, the material is going out, and there's no real processing that happens. But in a country like Vietnam, for example, which is an importer of low viscosity PET, processes it, and exports high viscosity PET. So you have countries who are not necessarily producing the plastic in their own country, but they're doing some value addition to the polymers and then, sending it forth. So, I mean, if you were to imagine this to be, if there was an assembly line, it's a really huge global assembly line where each country is adding some layer to it, is doing something with the chemical and sending it forth. And these are being sent on in ships. We've seen, for example, in India, in the past few months, we've seen two ships, ship-related accidents that have happened off our coast, and the impact that has had. So, along with the petrochemical industry, is also the shipping industry, which is connected, intrinsically to this whole thing, and whose stakes also then come into play and come into the picture. I'm also adding these layers to explain how then decision making is not just merely about a plastic product, but it involves all these layers of trade, of shipping, of reprocessing, value addition. All of these become party to the decision or a position that a country would take, and therefore trade then becomes very intrinsic to the production of polymers, plastics, but also to regulation of that. So yeah, those are some of the patterns. But just to summarize, when we looked at, we mapped across 4 monomers and 5 polymers, the most key ones for producing single-use plastics, which is the worst in terms of managing and the impact it has on health, impact it has on environment and climate. We found that, and we mapped the top 5 exporting countries and their top 5 importers, and we found that when it comes to the monomers and polymers, there are 11 exporting countries and 18 importing countries from Asia. Right, so Asia dominates in that sense the trade. And therefore also production, to a large extent on of monomers and polymers, and that's an emerging new trend which was in a sense anticipated by the International Energy Agency in 2017 when its Future of Petrochemicals report, when it said that Asia will be destination petrochemicals, and it seems like the current situation is not far from that prediction.
You mentioned such major economies who are interestingly involved in this trade, and layers upon layers, as you mentioned. I really like that example. Plus the industries which are involved. Obviously, the petrochemical industry in itself, which is so geopolitically significant and important sector, and is plugged into so many sectors. One major being shipping. One would expect that this global trade of polymers is regulated. So, firstly, can you explain how the regulation of the global trade of polymers happens? How is it governed? And also, if you can identify some of the gaps that there are in it.
Sure. So now there is the harmonized system which is used, to trade across boundaries, and that's how we got the data as well. Because through the harmonized system, data is gathered about these are certain codes that are given to each of the chemicals. It's quite a complex listing of chemicals that are traded. So there is that information, and of course we then get the information of how much of these are traded. So the volumes, for example, are from that system. Um, so that gives us the data on what is being traded and what's not being traded. I won't say that it's the most perfect system, in the sense that a lot of chemicals could be clubbed together, understandably so. We can't have lakhs and lakhs of uh, you know uh, lists which have so many chemicals, or even goods and goods, because it's not just chemicals, it's goods as well. So some aggregation is of course needed to be able to make it manageable, but that also means that we don't know the particular details of the types of or the subcategories of these petrochemicals that are traded. So if we want to make decisions on or if there is, for example, certain global benchmarks, or national benchmarks of which country produces how much of trade, we will just need a little more data than there is right now, because it's not that it's not there, but it's also not enough to be able to take decisions of global targets and national targets as well. So that's one aspect of data, and inadequate data, not missing data, but inadequate data. The other part is that we have definitely have laws or international regulation on some kinds of trade. So we have international regulations on trade of hazardous chemicals, on waste trade. So all of those are there. There are some multilateral environmental agreements which look at that, but the problem is that none of them look at all petrochemicals, right? It's hazardous chemicals. And that's only a percentage of all of these chemicals that are used. Waste trade is, of course, waste trade. It's the downstream. So there is no particular regulation in terms of how much of, how much of petrochemical can cross a border or enter. There's no global regulation, and that's also what we're trying to get to tell the governments and the countries, that it's important for the global plastics treaty to have trade enshrined inside this treaty. Because that's a huge gap. There's no one keeping an eye on how much of this is crossing borders, what are the implications. And my colleague also worked on the emissions part of this, that when you're trading polymers, you're basically trading hydrocarbons, and so you're trading emissions. And so what is the implication of that, right? That's not even been factored anywhere. And my colleague will throw more light on these issues of emissions, and how emissions is inadvertently getting traded through the trade of polymers, but that's simply not even considered anywhere. And the WTO does have a kind of a dialogue, a dialogue group on the dialogue on plastic pollution, as they call it. But it's a dialogue. It's not. It's nothing more than that. It's perhaps a statement of intention, or but not aspiration in that sense. So yeah. So trade in petrochemicals is actually a big gap in and of itself. There's nobody keeping an eye on that part of it. Um, and of course, how it could possibly be compromising governments and their climate commitments when they are inadvertently trading hydrocarbons, when they're trading petrochemicals. So both these aspects actually exist as a massive gap. In our study, we also looked at some of the laws of regulation across the plastic life cycle, not just trade, but just the plastics life cycle. And then we had some really interesting, observations on this. And I think that there were about 1,300 odd laws of different countries, that was analyzed by 1,434 plastic laws, globally, by the Plastic Pollution Coalition is an organization which did it. And in that we saw that there were 1,246 laws on on managing single use plastics, but that's the downstream, that's the end. And there were only about if I'm not mistaken, 17 laws on production and manufacturing of polymers itself, and this is global, and this is not trade, this is just the production manufacturing, and there was no law on trade of upstream. So there's really nobody looking at the trade of polymers, given it's so key to the production process itself. There's no real governance mechanism in place yet, to look at trade of polymers itself. And how then do you keep checks and balances of production and consumption of plastics?
Very interesting. Thank you. And I think we have a short video to run to visually drive the point that you were trying to say.
I'm IEEFA energy finance analyst Connor Chung, and I wanted to take a moment to talk about the climate implications of the global plastics treaty negotiations. First things first, the scale of carbon embedded in petrochemical value chains is immense. In our recent briefing note, we looked at the polyethylene exports from just the top 5 exporters and found that the process emissions and carbon content embedded in this flow accounts for more than 100 million tons of emissions in terms of carbon dioxide equivalent. To put it another way, the footprint of this single category of products from just 5 sources alone is analogous in scale to the emissions of a mid-sized industrial country. We've talked about how a robust plastics treaty with strong trade provisions makes sense from an economic perspective alone. We've discussed how plastics is a complex, interconnected, globalized market. So any effort to reduce pollution kind of needs to start at the source. But plastics treaty negotiations will also have major climate implications too. In the climate space, policymakers often highlight 2 key risks of policy decisions: carbon leakage and carbon lock-in. Leakage is where countries, through their own policies, perhaps unintentionally, offshore emissions to other jurisdictions, driving paper decarbonization while doing little to bend the actual global carbon curve. A failure to account for trade in plastics negotiations would only heighten the potentials for this sort of carbon leakage, allowing non-party states to hinder treaty success. It would risk cases where the production of plastics emissions is merely offloaded to other balance sheets, or none at all, given the gaps and imprecisions in how petrochemical emissions are tallied up. Consumer countries need to consider how a treaty without trade is one that risks leaving them exposed to this sort of leakage. Lock-in, meanwhile, is where the continued growth of demand for an energy source creates new sorts of emissions and generates economic and political forces that ensure their staying power. A failure to regulate the plastics trade at the global level would create new pathways for lock-in that undermine domestic decarbonization prospects. It would also create potential reputational and commercial viabilities, as changing global demand patterns and rising environmental consciousness reshape markets for these products. Producer countries, too, should consider how the export of significant embedded emissions to the world market might hinder their own claim to transition leadership. And then there's simply the question of member states' policy autonomy. If a treaty doesn't address trade, non-party states could undermine treaty members' climate policies, flooding the market with emissions-intensive plastic, even as domestic production takes place. We've seen countries realize this when it comes to carbon taxes, through the application of tools like CBAM's carbon border adjustment mechanisms, where a country says, if you're producing this product in a jurisdiction without carbon pricing, without rigorous environmental regulation, and you want to send it to us, we're going to charge an adjustment fee to ensure that this product doesn't undercut our own product, which is produced in a policy space with carbon pricing or with these other sorts of regulations. It helps ensure that transborder carbon leakage doesn't happen, helps ensure that foreign powers can't weaponize trade to undercut domestic policy commitments. The case for a plastics treaty that takes trade into account is basically the same. If countries set goals for plastics reduction, but leave themselves open to these global markets, other non-party states will easily be able to undermine their domestic plans. Will a treaty make sense on economic and financial grounds alone? A treaty that takes trade into account? States should recognize that this is also an opportunity to advance their records of climate leadership.
Swati, what is the importance of trade measures then in multilateral environment agreements? And the things that you have talked about, the paper that you have written. Why is this conversation relevant, especially now?
Yeah, so there are a few reasons for why trade is important. In particularly in the context of an MEA, in the context of a global agreement to control anything, and especially plastic pollution. To be able to uphold or to be able to fulfill the commitments of a treaty, of whatever instrument that emerges from these negotiations, if so that there's no weakening and there's no dilution of that instrument, trade needs to be considered. A very simple first point is that countries who think that this is too high ambition of a treaty and it will control plastics in a very significant way, but are pushing for a lower ambition of in the treaty, who want to continue plastic production, trade, consumption, they might at the end of the day choose not to sign the treaty or whatever instrument that emerges. And so they won't sign it, which means that they're off the hook in that sense, so they're not governed by this treaty. They can continue to function the way they wish. Now, look at the countries who are there, in this, some of them, not all of them, obviously, but some of the key countries in this, if they choose not to sign the treaty, then they will continue to trade among themselves, right? So because they've not signed the treaty, and if the treaty does not have strong non-party measures, when we say non-party measures, we mean those who have not signed the treaty, so they're not party to the treaty. And if there are not enough measures on trade between the parties who have signed, measures about trading with parties who have not signed, then this kind of trade will just continue despite the existence of this treaty. So not having trade measures will end up resulting in the treaty being weakened and its provisions being diluted. So that's just step number one, that you don't have trade measures in this treaty, then, and it's not being governed by any others, right? I mean, so that's the other thing that we've agreed earlier, that there is nothing else which is governing trade in polymers. And if this treaty also does not, then it's in effectly creating a condition for non-compliance of the treaty, right? So therefore that's extremely important. Now, if there are environmental standards, I mean, another example is if there are, for example, trade measures, if it is either a ban or if there is a fee of some kind, or if there is a charge for trading, then it increases, for example, the cost of that good, those goods which are being traded, which means that those who are party to the treaty and who are paying that environmental cost or whatever for having traded those goods would be adding a certain, cost to the product, while those who are not party to this treaty, who are trading freely, will not be incurring this additional cost, if at all. I mean, I'm just giving an example. And so then their products will be cheaper than those who are part of the treaty. And then that's not level playing field, because they've scuttled any kind of accountability by not signing the treaty. Those who have signed the treaty then in a way are being punished for having signed the treaty, because it will increase the cost. I'm just giving this as an example. I'm not saying that there will be a fee, but there will be some disincentive to trading, right? And whatever the disincentive it could be the form of a national target that you can't trade more than this amount. It eventually has an impact on the economy, right? And therefore it will be a disproportionate impact. For those who have not parties will continue earning, while those who are parties will not be able to. So that creates a distortion among countries, who are producing the same materials. For example, it could be ethylene or polyethylene, and it's the same product being produced by both countries, but then some being punished for having signed and some not being punished, and so the level playing field. So then their plastic will be cheaper than the plastic produced by a country who has some kind of regulation. um, uh, uh, and of course it'll affect the environmental objectives also. Finally, those who sign the treaty will have their emissions controlled, but those who don't sign the treaty won't have their emissions controlled. And from a global perspective, this is not good, because it still means emissions going out, and having the impact that it would have. So these are some of the three broad reasons why the trade of polymers needs to be regulated, but needs to be regulated within this treaty. And the reason I'm constantly saying within this treaty is that there are some arguments made within the negotiations. Some countries say we don't need to regulate trade in this treaty because the Stockholm Convention is already regulating trade of hazardous chemicals, or the BRS is already, the Basel Convention is already regulating waste trade, or that WTO already regulates trade overall. But like we said earlier, the BRS conventions, the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm conventions will not look at all chemicals, right? They only look at hazardous chemicals or certain listed chemicals as part of that those treaties. And that the WTO doesn't particularly regulate trade of, to limit the production of plastics. The way they regulate trade, their objectives are completely, different than the objectives of, the Global Plastics Treaty. So you can't have, I like to say that you can't have the governance of a treaty sitting in another treaty. That makes no sense. That makes that completely weakens the governance of this treaty. And we've learned from other MEAs, governance is everything. And unless countries are held accountable by a governance mechanism located within the treaty, even where those exist, it's so difficult to hold countries accountable. And if we were to outsource governance of trade into other treaties which actually don't even exist, or other bodies and mechanisms which also don't exist, then this is then a free for all. And frankly speaking, I then don't see how this treaty would even stand up on its feet, if trade is not a part of it. And why it's important, therefore, to talk right now. We are in the final round of negotiations next month. And in the past couple of rounds of negotiations, trade has kind of vanished from the discussions. Of course, there have been other, choke points because of which perhaps trade vanished. But even if you were to resolve the existing, pinch points within the negotiations today, if trade doesn't find its space, a lot of what they will agree on will end up being diluted if trade is also not agreed on.
Very pertinent points. Thank you for saying that. And so I also wanted to, ask with you now that, we're in the last leg of negotiations. Can you give us a view of the negotiating table in terms of what are some of the emerging positions on this, on including trade measures, a part of the treaty? What are some of the thoughts that are emerging? What's, say, a global north is saying or global south is saying? You can identify the participants and what are their positions that have emerged till yet.
Yeah, I can't necessarily identify the participants because there is Chatham House rules, and I'm not at liberty to then say some of that. But just to say that there are countries who are very serious, who want an ambitious treaty, who want a treaty which is effective, not just ambitious for the sake of ambition, but ambitious because they want to hit at the root of plastic pollution, recognizing that it starts from, the production of the monomers and polymers without which the plastics won't exist, So it is the full life cycle. So there is that group of countries. There is a group of countries who believe that plastics are absolutely necessary. They're needed for development. and that the plastics life cycle does not start at the monomers and polymers, but it starts only when the plastic product is produced. And so product design is what they would consider, an upstream issue. But what we've been trying to also say is that the life cycle really starts with the birth of the product, and the birth of the product is the polymer. If there was no polymer, there would be no plastic, right? 99% of plastics today is made from fossil fuels. It's only a minor 1% which is not, right? So it is this fossil fuel polymers which is producing the plastic. Now, so then this group of countries say that not only should trade not be a part of it, but polymers are not a part of the treaty. And so trade in polymers is also not a part of the treaty. So there are these two broad groups, and of course there are other countries who, are located along this entire, spectrum. Uh, uh, I mean, it's not surprising, but the petrostates would take the position that you need the polymers and you need the plastics because they have stakes, in it. And I would say not necessarily all petrostates. There are a few high ambition countries who might also be taking a slightly more, and there might be a petrostate and taking some slightly more progressive stance. But largely the petrostates, are taking a stance where we need plastics, we need polymers, and without it, development can't happen, cornerstone of economies, and things like that, And so this is where, the broad spectrum of positions lie. And of course, the low ambition countries do not want trade to be a part of it. They've been very vocal. And like I said, in the past two negotiations, trade has not even emerged as a significant, point of discussion because other issues have been far more contentious. So that's the broad, positioning of the groups of countries. And just one response also, especially to those countries who are saying that it's needed for economic development, etc., is that we're also seeing that the petrochemical industry is in a state of secular decline. It is in a structural decline. Margins are pinched. Company financials are not looking good. Rating agencies, there is a risk of credit rating agencies downgrading, the credit profiles. And therefore, in fact, even from an economic point of view, it makes sense to rethink this dependency of economies on the petrochemical industry. The petrochemical industry is not the silver bullet that is going to get the petrostates out of the downturn on the use of oil and gas because of shift to electric vehicles and renewable energy. And it is being seen as an escape hatch. The petrochemical industry is being seen as an escape hatch. And it's important also for these countries to realize that this will only go to a point because it is in structural decline. And all estimates, all predictions by different organizations and companies suggest that even if it does bounce back, it's not going to bounce back to what it was. There is a growing awareness, growing understanding of climate impacts, the health impacts of petrochemicals, like you've already recorded in your earlier, in the first version of these series. People are recognizing that. So even economically, it makes sense to, not put all your eggs in the petrochemical basket, and better to hedge your bet and diversify. And we also highlight that point, in our report, saying because that's one of the positions that is being taken, is that we need it for the economy. But really, how beneficial will it be for the economy is a question that, countries will need to ask. And again, there is enough evidence of, of the global slowdown on the use of petrochemicals, not just plastics, but all kinds of, petrochemicals. So even from that point of view, I think, but then the economic angle is perhaps just that excuse to push the continued use of plastics. But yeah. So that's something that the countries need to seriously consider, because these are, when it's economies at stake, it's also people's economics at stake.
As I speak with you, I feel that there's so much to unpack on this issue, but we're short of time. So I'll move to my concluding questions where I ask for your recommendations. And this is more important because the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee of the United Nations Environmental Assembly will hold its final round of negotiation on the International Legally Binding Instrument, or ILBI, to end plastic pollutions. So, what are your recommendations for trade measures in the ongoing negotiations for this global plastic treaty?
Uh, we have two broad recommendations that we've mentioned. One is that we need global and national targets for polymer production itself, because trade is linked to that. It's not devoid of that. So there is an absolutely an essential need for global and national targets for the production and consumption of primary plastic polymers. That's one necessary step that needs to be taken. And drawing from there is that trade then be enshrined within the treaty or whatever instrument that emerges from these negotiations, that it is seen as an inherent element, that it's not an additional element, especially the upstream trade, because what we've proven with this paper is also that upstream trade is linked to upstream or polymer production. It is linked to plastic manufacturing, and then so on and so forth. So it's an inherent aspect of the global and national targets, and not an additional thing or a separate thing. When we are setting global and national targets, we'll also need to look at trade and trade governance alongside it, and not as a separate element of the governance itself. So these are the two broad recommendations that we have made for the treaty. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks for this fantastic conversation. And thank you for joining us here at the Climate Trends podcast. And we look forward to what comes out of the treaty. And hopefully, we'll have a chance to speak with you again after that.